The Galactic Concord had seen wars. Real wars. The kind that scorched entire star systems, that turned moons into debris fields, that left species extinct before they even got a chance to develop agriculture. The Vreth had fought the Corelli for 600 years over a gas giant nobody actually needed. The Shun had collapsed their own sun trying to win a civil war. War in this galaxy was a language everyone spoke fluently. So when humanity showed up, the Concord filed them under primitive, aggressive, probably temporary, standard procedure. You catalog the new species, you observe them for a century or two, and if they haven't blown themselves up by then, you consider letting them sit at the table. Humanity had been on that list for about 80 years. Aggressive, yes. Resourceful, absolutely. But still so very small. Still so very new. What nobody at the Concord had bothered to read, and I mean really read, not just the executive summary, was the footnote buried in Section 14 of the original Human Observation Report. It was filed by a Vreth analyst named Gorveth, who was considered slightly paranoid even by Vreth standards, and the footnote read as follows. Warning, these creatures have a documented psychological phenomenon with no equivalent in any cataloged species. They call it protective aggression. When their healthy members fight, they are dangerous. When their wounded members fight, no data. Insufficient sample size. Recommend further observation before any military engagement. Nobody read footnotes. This is a universal truth. Even aliens ignore footnotes. And so, on the 14th day of what the Concord had casually labeled the pacification campaign, Warlord Droon of the Keth Dominion made the single worst tactical decision in the recorded history of this arm of the galaxy. He ordered the hospital ships destroyed first. Now, I want you to understand something about the Keth before we go any further. Because context matters here. The Keth were not evil in some cartoonish, mustache-twirling way. They were pragmatic, cold, deeply, profoundly practical. They had conquered 11 species in the last 2 centuries, and their method was always the same. You do not fight an enemy's soldiers. You fight an enemy's will to fight. You cut supply lines. You eliminate infrastructure. You make the war feel unwinnable before the first major engagement. It had worked 11 times. Droon looked at the human fleet with the calm, analytical eyes of someone who had done this before, and he identified the soft targets immediately. The medical vessels, the hospital ships, the floating sanctuaries that humans, for reasons the Keth found genuinely baffling, filled with their injured soldiers, rather than simply leaving them behind. Inefficient, Droon had noted in his battle log, sentimental to the point of military liability. He was not wrong about the sentiment. He was catastrophically wrong about the liability part. The IHS Carrington was the largest of humanity's hospital ships in the Valen system. 12 decks, 3,000 patients, staff of 800. Commander Priya Osei-Mensah ran it the way she ran everything, with absolute precision and exactly zero tolerance for nonsense. She had 2 robotic arms because she'd lost the originals on Kepler Station during a Keth raid 3 years prior, and she had continued performing surgery for 4 hours after losing them, using a field kit and a lot of profanity, before anyone had made her stop. She was, by most accounts, the least frightening-looking person on the ship. She was 5 feet 2, she wore reading glasses, and she drank an alarming amount of tea. When the Keth missiles struck the outer hull of Deck 9, Priya was in the middle of rerouting the ship's coolant system with one mechanical hand, while simultaneously reviewing patient charts with the other. She felt the impact the way you feel a car accident. That split second of pure, crystalline awareness before your brain catches up to what your body already knows. She set down the chart. She looked at the damage report on the screen above her. Then she opened the ship-wide channel. All patients who are ambulatory, report to armory stations. All staff, Emergency Protocol 7. We are not going anywhere. There was a pause on the channel. Then Lieutenant Boaz Ferreira, her head of security, a man who had spent 6 years on the ship and had genuinely believed his most dangerous days were behind him, said, very quietly, "Commander, we have 3,000 injured personnel on this ship." "Yes," said Priya, "we do. Some of them are missing limbs." Boaz, armory stations. What happened next on the IHS Carrington would eventually be declassified about 40 years later, and the report would be studied in military academies across 7 species for the next 2 centuries. Not because of the tactics. The tactics were, by any professional standard, absolutely unhinged, but because of what those tactics revealed about a thing that no alien military strategist had ever thought to model. Humans, when they are healthy, fight to win. Humans, when they're wounded or threatened, fight with something that has no clean translation in Keth, or Vreth, or Shun. The closest approximation in galactic standard is Mieth Vora, which loosely means the fury of one who has already decided they will not survive this and has therefore removed all limits. The Keth assault team that boarded Deck 9 encountered Private First Class Tomoko Adebisi approximately 40 seconds into their breach. Tomoko had been on the Carrington for 3 weeks, recovering from a spinal injury. She was technically not cleared for physical activity. She was wearing a hospital gown. She had somehow acquired a plasma torch from the maintenance bay, a titanium tray from the cafeteria, and an attitude that the Keth assault commander would later describe in his after-action report as inexplicable and deeply unsettling. She had been using a walker 2 days ago. She was not using a walker now. The assault team retreated from Deck 9. This was not in their mission parameters. Assault teams of the Keth Dominion did not retreat from hospital gowns. And yet, meanwhile, outside the Carrington, the broader situation was developing in ways that Warlord Droon had also not accounted for. The news of the hospital ship strikes had reached the human fleet's main combat group 11 minutes after impact. Admiral Cressida Nufor received the report while she was in the middle of coordinating a defensive retreat, a careful, measured withdrawal that her strategists had spent 3 days planning, designed to preserve ships, preserve lives, and buy time for reinforcements. She read the report. She set it down. She looked at her tactical display for exactly 7 seconds. Then she said, "Forget the retreat. All ships, we go forward." Her first officer, Commander Sven Halvorsen, a man of such studied calm that his crew sometimes checked if he had a pulse, looked at her. "Admiral, we are outnumbered 2 to 1. I know. Our defensive position is significantly stronger than an offensive one given current." "Sven?" "Yes, Admiral. They hit the hospital ships." Sven Halvorsen, who had served in the human fleet for 22 years and understood things that no tactical manual could quite articulate, simply nodded. He turned back to his console. "All ships, forward engagement, maximum acceleration." Droon watched this on his tactical display with the expression of a man who had just realized the floor was actually a trapdoor. The human fleet was not retreating. It was accelerating toward his formation at a speed that made no logical sense given their numerical disadvantage, and the energy signatures coming off their weapon systems were elevated, substantially elevated, as if the ships themselves were angry, which, in a way, they were. The first wave of human ships hit the Keth formation like something that defied the cold mathematics of fleet engagement. The Keth were excellent fighters, disciplined, coordinated. They had scripts for every scenario, counters for every maneuver. What they did not have a script for was an enemy that had stopped calculating odds. The human ships were taking hits that should have made them pull back, and they were not pulling back. They were pushing in closer. The Keth formation, which had looked so clean and geometrically precise 20 minutes ago, was beginning to develop irregular gaps. Droon ordered his reserve wing to flank. Standard doctrine. The reserve wing began its maneuver and immediately encountered Captain Ola delle Marchetti's battle group, which had somehow already anticipated the flanking route and was sitting directly in it, waiting with the particular patience of someone who has been angry for the last 11 minutes and has finally found somewhere to put it. Ola delle Marchetti was an interesting person. He had grown up in Lagos, studied engineering, joined the fleet on what he described to his family as a temporary adventure, and had been in it for 31 years because one temporary adventure had kept leading to another. He had a reputation for being methodical, careful, the kind of commander who ran the numbers 3 times before committing to anything. He had not run the numbers this time. He had heard about the Carrington, and he had simply moved his battle group to where it needed to be, And now he was looking at the Keth reserve wing emerging directly into his targeting solutions, and something behind his eyes that was usually kept on a very short leash was running free. "All guns," he said, with a calm that was somehow more frightening than shouting "fire." The reserve wing ceased to be a reserve wing. It became a problem for the Keth salvage teams, assuming any of them survived long enough to have salvage teams. Back on the Carrington, the situation had taken a turn that Priya Ose Mensa had not specifically planned for but had, somewhere deep in the experienced part of her brain, considered possible. The Keth boarding party on Deck 9 had been neutralized, mostly by Tomoko Adebisi and a rotating group of patients who had apparently decided that lying in a hospital bed was less interesting than what was happening in the corridor. The secondary boarding team that the Keth had sent as reinforcement had encountered Dr. Yusuf Tamboli, the ship's chief trauma surgeon, who had been doing surgery for 19 hours straight, had emerged from the operating theater to find soldiers in his hospital, and had reacted with the specific, terrifying energy of a man who has been awake too long and has run entirely out of patience. Dr. Tamboli was 58 years old. He had hands that could repair a heart valve through a 2-centimeter incision. He had, in the last 10 minutes, demonstrated that those same hands were useful for other things. Priya watched the corridor feeds with something that was almost admiration. Then she opened the channel to the fleet, IHS Carrington to Admiral Nabor. "We are secure. We have 18 Keth prisoners. We also have approximately 40 patients who are going to need re-evaluation because they have, apparently, been less injured than their charts suggested. Request immediate medical resupply and, if possible, someone to explain to Dr. Tamboli that the situation is under control before he does something else." There was a brief silence on the fleet channel. Then Admiral Nuofor's voice, which carried the particular quality of someone who was simultaneously proud and slightly alarmed. "Understood, Carrington. Stand by." Warlord Droon was standing by as well, standing by and watching his tactical display rearrange itself into configurations that his decades of military experience had never prepared him for. His flanking wing was gone. His forward formation was being pushed back by a human fleet that was still technically outnumbered and seemed completely unaware of this fact. And somewhere in the back of his strategic mind, a small, quiet alarm was beginning to sound. He had hit the hospital ships. He had done this because it was doctrine, because it was practical, because it had always worked before. He was beginning to understand that the humans had a different set of rules, and that those rules had just been activated, and that he had been the one to activate them. His communications officer turned from the console with an expression Droon had never seen on a Keth face before. It was not fear exactly. It was something more specific. It was the look of someone who has been given information and is not sure they want to be the one to deliver it. "Warlord," the officer said carefully, "we are receiving transmissions from the human fleet. They are not negotiating." "What are they doing?" The officer paused. "They are informing us of what happens next." Droon looked at his tactical display. He looked at the gaps in his formation. He looked at the energy readings on the human fleet, which had not diminished, had in fact increased, as if the ships were drawing power from somewhere that his sensors could not identify, which was impossible. But here they were. He thought about the footnote he had never read. "Put it through," he said. Admiral Cressida Nufor's voice came through the Keth command channel like something that had been sharpened specifically for this moment. Not loud, not theatrical. The worst threats never are. "Warlord Droon, this is Admiral Nufor of the Human Defense Fleet. You struck our hospital ships 43 minutes ago. I want you to understand something clearly, so there is no confusion about what is happening right now. We were leaving. We had a withdrawal plan, coordinates filed, a very sensible retreat that my strategists were quite proud of. You ended that plan when you hit the Carrington. What you are experiencing now is not a counterattack. It is not a military operation in any framework your doctrine recognizes. What you are experiencing is the consequence of the specific thing you chose to do. I recommend you think carefully about your next decision, because you are running out of them." The channel closed. Droon sat in silence for 4 seconds. Then he said, to no one in particular, "Get me the Concorde." The Galactic Concorde, for those unfamiliar, is not a fast-moving institution. It has 1,700 member species, a bureaucratic structure that makes geological processes look impulsive, and a general philosophy that most conflicts will resolve themselves if you give them enough centuries. Emergency sessions are technically possible. They require a formal request, a quorum of senior delegates, and a very compelling reason that can be summarized in fewer than 50 words for the attention span of the Vreth representative, who is ancient and easily distracted. Drune's request reached the Concord in 40 minutes. The summary read, "Human fleet has responded to standard pacification strike with unprecedented aggression, requesting immediate intervention. Situation developing faster than models predicted." Delegate Shorvan of the Vreth, who had been a senior observer for 300 years and had seen exactly this kind of message before, read it twice. Then she pulled up the original human observation report. Then she found section 14. Then she found the footnote. She read the footnote. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said, to her aide, "Get me a channel to the Keth command ship, and find whoever filed this footnote, because I owe Gorveth an apology that is about 80 years overdue." The battle in the Valence system had, by this point, stopped resembling a battle in any conventional sense, and had begun resembling something that military historians would later struggle to categorize. The Keth were not losing in the way armies usually lose. Ground given up, ships retreating in organized patterns, a clean tactical withdrawal. They were losing the way a structure loses when you remove the wrong support, suddenly in places nobody expected, with a cascade effect that their commanders kept trying to model and kept failing to predict. Captain Ola Del Marchetti's battle group had pushed through the collapsed flank and was now operating in the Keth formation's interior, which was exactly as chaotic as it sounds. Ola Del was a methodical man who had temporarily suspended his methodology, and what was underneath the methodology turned out to be something quite effective and extremely uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of. He was coordinating 3 ships simultaneously across a combat zone that kept changing shape, and he was doing it with the particular focused energy of someone who had a very specific thing in mind, and was not stopping until he reached it. The thing he had in mind was the Keth command ship. Lieutenant Rasha Petrov, his navigation officer, 26 years old, from a small city near the Ural Mountains, who had joined the fleet because she'd read too many adventure novels as a child, and had romantic notions that reality had mostly corrected except apparently not entirely, was threading their ship through gaps in the Keth formation that were technically too small for a ship their size. "Rasha," Oladeli said, watching the hull clearance readings. "Those numbers are not comfortable." "No, sir," said Rasha, who was concentrating very hard and did not look up. "The margin on the port side is—" "I see it, sir. That's not a margin, that's a suggestion. We'll be through in 8 seconds, sir." They were through in 7. Rasha allowed herself exactly 1 sharp exhale. Then she found the next gap and started threading that one too. On the Keth command ship, Drune was watching this approach with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years building a military doctrine, and was watching someone drive straight through it as if it were made of paper. His defensive screens were responding, his point defense systems were firing. None of it was making the human battle group slow down in any meaningful way, because the humans had apparently decided that slowing down was something other people did. His second-in-command, Sub-Warlord Theek, a veteran of 9 campaigns, decorated, unflappable in the way that only people who have survived genuinely terrible situations can be, leaned over and said, very quietly, "Warlord, perhaps we should discuss contingency options." "We have contingency options," Drune said. "I mean the ones that involve moving this ship." Drune looked at his display. The human battle group was close enough now that he could see the individual ship designations. The lead vessel was called, according to the human registry, the HSF Adamant. He thought about the name for a moment. He thought it was probably not a coincidence. "Prepare to withdraw," he said. It was the first time he had said those words in 22 years of command, and they tasted exactly as bad as he'd always imagined they would. Meanwhile, in a completely different part of the battle that everyone had slightly forgotten about because of how dramatic the main engagement had become, Tomoko Adebisi was sitting on the floor of Deck 9 corridor of the IHS Carrington, back against the wall, plasma torch across her knees, and having a conversation with her physical therapist. Her physical therapist was Nurse Dami Okafor, who had started his shift 12 hours ago expecting a routine day of spinal rehabilitation exercises, and had instead spent the last hour doing triage on Keth prisoners, applying emergency medical protocols to 3 patients who had re-injured themselves during the corridor engagement, and trying very hard not to think too much about any of it. "You walked," Dami said. He was looking at her with the specific expression of a medical professional confronting data that contradicts his chart notes. "Yes," said Tomoko. "Without the walker, yes, for an extended period." "There was motivation," Tomoko said reasonably. Dami looked at the corridor, which had recently been a combat zone and still looked like one. He looked at Tomoko, who was visibly exhausted but also appeared to be in one piece. He looked at his medical scanner, which was giving him readings he was going to have to write a very interesting report about. "The human body," he said, mostly to himself, "is an absolute mystery." "Tell me about it," said Tomoko, and closed her eyes. Dr. Yusuf Tamboli had, by this point, been located, given a cup of coffee, and gently guided back to the operating theater by 2 nurses who had extensive experience managing him when he was in this particular state. He had, on the way, stopped to check on 4 patients, correct a dosage error he spotted from across the ward, and explain to a Keth prisoner who was asking confused questions about their medical treatment that yes, they were being treated, no, it was not a trick, and that he, Yusuf Tamboli, had not spent 30 years in medicine to let anyone bleed out on his ship regardless of who they were, which was a philosophical position he held with complete sincerity and absolutely no warmth whatsoever. The Keth prisoner had stared at him for a long time after that. Commander Priya Ose Mensa watched this exchange on the corridor feed and thought, not for the first time, that Yusuf was a deeply strange and entirely necessary human being. The Concorde's emergency channel opened 40 minutes after Droon had called for it, which was, by Concorde standards, essentially instantaneous. Delegate Shorvan's face appeared on screens across both fleets, old, patient, with eyes that had watched enough history to know exactly what they were looking at. "This session is called under Emergency Clause 14, she said, regarding a military engagement in the Valen system involving Keth Dominion forces and the Human Defense Fleet. We have reviewed the engagement timeline. We have noted the initiating action." A pause, the kind of pause that carries weight. The Concorde formally recognizes that the first strike against designated medical vessels constitutes a violation of the Koveth Accords, to which the Keth Dominion is a signatory. "Warlord Droon, you will stand down your forces immediately and submit to a full tribunal review." Droon said nothing for a moment. "Then, the humans are not Concorde members. The Accords, Shorvan said, with the patient precision of someone who has read every word of them, protect medical personnel and facilities in any armed conflict involving a signatory power, regardless of the opposing party's membership status. You know this, Warlord. Your legal team knows this. I suspect you knew it before you gave the order and made a calculation." Another pause. "I would be very interested to hear how that calculation has worked out." The battle in the Valen system ended not with a ceasefire negotiation, but with a Keth withdrawal that was, to put it diplomatically, not orderly. The HSF Adamant and Oladella's battle group followed them to the edge of the system and then stopped, not because they couldn't continue, but because Admiral Nufor had given the order to stop, and Nufor's orders were the kind that got followed even when the people following them were still furious. Especially then. The debrief happened 3 days later, aboard the fleet command vessel, with Priya Ose Mensa attending via comlink from the Carrington because she had 1,200 patients who still needed managing and was not going to leave them for a meeting, no matter who called it. Admiral Nufor went through the engagement numbers. Ships lost. Ships damaged. Personnel casualties. She read them in the flat, careful voice that senior officers develop specifically for reading casualty lists. No inflection, no hesitation, because hesitation is where the grief gets in, and grief right now is something to be carried quietly and dealt with later. Then she looked around the room. "The Carrington held," she said, 3,000 patients, 800 staff. They held their ship, they captured 18 enemy combatants, and they sent us a transmission in the middle of all of it asking for resupply. A pause. I've submitted recommendations for decorations for Commander Ose Mensa, Dr. Tamboli, Lieutenant Ferreira, Nurse Okafor, and PFC Adebisi. There will be others. The full list is in your packets. Captain Marchetti, who was attending in person and had not slept in 40 hours and looked like it, said, "What happens to Droon?" "Tribunal," said Mufor. "Concord jurisdiction. Shorvan assures me it will be thorough." She said the word thorough in a way that suggested she had been given reassurances she found partially satisfying. "And the Keth Dominion?" Nufor was quiet for a moment. "They have been in contact. Through back channels. They want to discuss terms." She looked at the table. "They're scared." Nobody in the room said anything to that. Somewhere across the system, in what remained at the Keth Command Formation, a communications officer was writing a report that would eventually be filed in the Keth Dominion's classified military archives, under a category that had to be created specifically for it. The category was titled, in rough translation, "Engagements where our doctrine failed completely, and we do not fully understand why." The report itself was detailed, technically precise, and deeply confused in the way that only documents written by people confronting something they weren't trained for can be. In the conclusion, the officer wrote, "Recommend full review of tactical assumptions regarding human response to medical facility targeting. Preliminary assessment suggests this category of action triggers a response mode in human forces that does not correspond to any modeled behavior. Human forces in this mode appear to disregard numerical disadvantage, tactical risk assessment, and standard escalation patterns. Further study required." Note, this recommendation assumes we will have the opportunity to study further, which, given how the last 48 hours went, is not something I am comfortable taking for granted. In the Concord's Great Archive, Gorvith's footnote was quietly promoted from an appendix to the main body of the Human Observation Report. Shorvan wrote the recommendation herself, in the formal Vreth script that was used for documents considered particularly significant. The note she added read, "This analyst's observation has been verified in full. The phenomenon of human protective aggression, when triggered by harm to wounded or medically vulnerable individuals, produces a response escalation that renders standard military modeling unreliable. This is not a gap in our data. This is a fundamental feature of human psychology that the Concord failed to account for across 8 decades of observation. We will not make this error again." She paused, then added one more line. "Neither, I suspect, will the Keth." Tomoko Adebisi was cleared for light walking exercises 2 weeks later. Dami Okafor documented this with the careful neutrality of a medical professional and did not mention that she had, by any physiological metric, already demonstrated she could do considerably more than that. Some things he had decided were better left between a patient and their chart. She was, apparently, healing faster than expected. Most of them were.